Hi, Tom Klaus here with Tenacious Change. Have I got a treat for you today? A couple of days ago, Dr. Wendy Edmonds sat down with me for a conversation on the topic of toxic followership. Now, Wendy is an assistant professor at Bowie State University in the College of Professional Studies. Bowie State is located in Bowie, Maryland, only about 15 miles from my office, and it is the oldest and first historically Black college and university in the state of Maryland. Wendy is the first researcher to ever get to interview the survivors of the 1978 Jonestown Massacre in Guyana, South America. Now, what does that have to do with our conversation today? Well, if you're going to study the topic of toxic followership, then you must learn more about what happened in Jonestown in 1978. And that's exactly what Wendy did. In our conversation today, she's going to talk to us about that process, and she's also going to talk to us about her findings and what she learned from the opportunity to sit and talk with the survivors of that terrible tragedy. We're also going to be talking about something very exciting that's happening in Wendy's life this month as well. And that is that on March 16th, her new book, Intoxicating Followership, is going to be released. Now, if you happen to be watching this video before March 16th, you can go to her website, drwendymedmonds.com, and you can pre-order that book. But if you're seeing it after the 16th, then just go to Amazon and purchase it there. You can either download it to your Kindle or you can have it shipped right to your home. But trust me, once you watch this interview, after you learn more about toxic followership, and once you get an opportunity to hear Wendy talk about this subject and her process in her own words, you're going to want to get that book. Okay, so you ready? We're going to start that interview now. So settle in, get comfortable, and get ready. Here we go. Wendy Edmonds, thank you so much for joining me for this interview today. I just have to begin by asking, how are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I am doing well. In spite of all that's going on around us. I'm happy to report that I'm doing well.
That's excellent. I'm really glad to hear that. I'm sure you join me and looking forward to the time when we can begin to see our lives return to something that resembles our lives before COVID-19 came into the picture. It's been a tough time. Well, speaking of the pre-COVID-19 world, in that world, in September of 2019, you and I were together in a workshop in Ottawa, Canada. And the workshop was being led by Ira Chaliff, who is the guy who created this concept of courageous followership and wrote the book entitled The Courageous Follower. And as we were doing a round of introductions in that first session, you said two things that really grabbed my attention. Number one, you said that you were from Bowie, Maryland. And I go, oh, wow. Look at that. Somebody else from Maryland. And in fact, Bowie is just a little ways from where I live here in Laurel, Maryland. The second thing that you said was, as you were talking about your work in that introduction, and you said that you were a student of toxic followership. And that really grabbed my attention. I grabbed my pen and I wrote that down on a piece of paper and I made a note, got to get to know this person better and find out what toxic followership is all about. And so, that's where I first heard the term. It's where I met you. And since that time, I've been looking forward to being able to have this conversation with you, not only for my benefit, but for the benefit of those people that are involved somewhat in the work that I do. So let's actually begin with the question that really I began to puzzle on. What do you mean by toxic followership? And who are toxic followers?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because when I use the term toxic followership, most people think I'm mispronouncing a word or there's something wrong and I'm going to clean it up later on. And that's not the case at all. So when I say toxic followership, I'm talking about a trusted individual that manipulates the mindset of others. And in doing so, those individuals begin to behave like the bad leader. So they have picked up on the extension of the moral decay of that leader, and that's how they begin to act. They do things that are unethical. And the extreme loyalty that they have for that leader puts them in a position where they are willing to even give up their life for them.
So, Wendy, I have this little question that's beginning to nag me now. What actually led you to your interest in toxic followership?
When I was in high school, I remember looking at the TV one day and seeing dead bodies everywhere. And it was breaking news. And I didn't understand it. I mean, how could this thing be? What was it? And it was the Jonestown Massacre. And so at the time that I was finished all of the classwork and embarking on beginning and writing my dissertation, there was a, what would you call it, a documentary that was being done on TV. And they mentioned survivors. And I didn't even know there were any survivors. And I thought, wow, this is going to be good. And I watched the documentary. And if there were 87 survivors, there weren't 87 survivors in this documentary. Some of those I should be able to reach. And I wanted to know, why in the world would somebody even follow someone to their grave? How can this be? And so that's when my interest into followership began. As I began to do the research, that's when I learned about toxic followership. So what I did was I was able to contact some of the survivors. And it wasn't an easy process either. It really wasn't an easy process. I went through different measures of trying to find people, and I ended up getting hate mail. Please don't do that. I'm not interested. And I thought, surely they want to talk to me. This is from an educational institution and I'm conducting research. And that was not the case at all. And there was one survivor who did respond. And that's how I was connected with everyone else. It was a long process. It was an interesting process because I had to go underground for a 2-week period. And underground meaning secret locations, so that they could feel safe in speaking to me and having conversations.
Wendy, you just said 3 things there that absolutely just grabbed me. The first, of course, as you mentioned, survivors. And that makes sense because this is the population that you're really wanting to try to reach out to. But then you said hate mail. And then you said going underground. Can you unpack that a little bit for me? I mean, I know that your research, you needed to be able to engage with the survivors. That makes sense. But receiving hate mail and then having to go underground to do your research, I'm assuming. Can you say more about that? Can you speak into those last 2 things as they relate to the research that you did?
So what happened is I began to conduct research on books that were written, articles that were written, the literature, and contacting the authors of books and authors of articles, people in general. Let me first say that I started with Soledad O'Brien, who did the documentary. That didn't happen. I never was able to contact her, but that was a good start for me. But really what happened is that when I did find emails in various places, They were very clear that they did not want to be contacted. How dare me to contact them? And as time went on, I realized where that came from, because it made me take a step back as, oh my goodness, because I don't want to offend anybody. That was not my goal. You know, trying to understand followership to this extent that you have this kind of ending. And so there was one person that responded. And remember, this is a sensitive situation. It's a sensitive subject, and people have been hurt. They have been exploited, and that's what they don't want anymore. And then behind that, the reason why I use the term underground isn't to sound spooky or eerie, but because I needed to make sure that they felt that they were in a safe place to share the information that they were going to share with me. And that took time to build trust, to get to know who I am. And that meant building relationships over this time frame too.
You know, Wendy, I'm really struck by the level of trauma that all of that suggests for the folks that came through the Jonestown Massacre. And not just the trauma, but the ongoing fear that they continue to feel for so many years afterwards because of that particular experience. And it seems completely reasonable. I have to confess that I am a little bit older than you. I was well out of high school by the time 1978 came along. And I remember watching the news that broke about the Jonestown Massacre. And it was stunning. It was horrific. And just the scope of the inhumanity of it was just breathtaking. And some of those images, I don't know that I will ever get out of my head, in fact, from those news programs. So coming out of that situation, it seems like it was very fortunate that there you had one person, one survivor who was willing to trust you. And that one survivor apparently opened a number of doors to other survivors for you, that you could get interviews and you could get focus groups to talk about that experience. So what I'm wondering is, as you began to talk with the survivors of Jonestown, and what is it that you began to learn from them that has shaped your understanding of toxic followership today?
I realized during those interviews that they were connected to the project, the agricultural project. Remember, these were people who went to Guyana, and in over 3,000 acres in the jungle, they carved out a community. And so that's something that they were very, very proud of. And it was family. They were like family. They had been in the church for a while, and extended members of their families were there. It's not just mother and daughter, or mother and son, or, husband and wife. There were families. And so they were committed to the project. I also discovered that some of them were children at that time and came into People's Temple because their parents joined, and their parents joined for different reasons. There was something very mystical about Jim Jones to them, because he was able to have healing services. People were getting healed. Who doesn't want to be well? And so he had this capability. There was a draw, there was a charisma about him that drew people to him. And in doing so, the target became those people who were in the church. If I can get them to believe in me, to believe that I am who I say I am, regardless of what you may see and how I act, I am who I tell you I am. then I can get you to do anything. And he did that over a period of time. He did that over a period of time of what I call courting, the conditioning, really having them to practice white nights, where they would practice drinking the poisonous drink over and over and over again. That's a test of loyalty. And then that is where he realizes that his control over them is magnificent. He can really get them to do anything.
So I'm reflecting on a presentation that I saw you do, I believe it was this last January, for a teaching followers group that you and I are both participants in. And in that presentation, you talked about the model that you created as a result of your research that was included in your dissertation. And a couple things I remember about that model was that it was pretty non-traditional, for a dissertation. In fact, you had a little bit of a battle with your dissertation committee about whether or not you actually could use this particular model. And the second thing I remember about it is because the model was actually in the shape and resembled an eyeball. And the eyeball, I believe, it represented a level of control or a way of controlling that Jim Jones had over his followers in Jonestown. And I'm wondering if you can say more about that image and how that fits in with this with the concept of toxic followership.
Okay, so yes, the in the pupil is where the light comes through, and that's what draws you to someone. That was representative of Jim Jones, who was a predator. A predator deliberately goes after their prey. They know exactly who they want. And when he walked into a room, everyone said that he just lit up a room. There was a certain magnetism about him. And then there are the followers, and the followers fall in two categories: the colluders and the conformers. And so the colluders are representative of the iris. The iris in the eyeball is the muscle. And that's his strength. That his muscle were his guards. Those are the ones in his inner circle closest to him. And then you have the outer part of the eye, which is the conformers. And in that area, there's two different roles. So the colluders, they are aggressive. His muscle will do anything because there's something in it for them. The conformers, not so much so. The conformers act out of fear. They act out of this whole feeling of, I'm going to serve him because either I have low self-esteem, there's not a better way, but I'm going to do that. And so there are more conformers than colluders because the colluders have to be trusted. But in that space, that's where recruiting takes place. So the conformers, who were the hunted, become the hunters, because it's all about increasing the population for those who will serve him as God.
Wow. So what I remember from your presentation in January as well is, and I think I got this right, that Jim Jones would like use his eyes in a way to engage deeply with people, to kind of bring them into relationship with himself and with his organization. But the funny thing about that is, what I remember about Jim Jones is that he always seemed to be wearing these really dark aviator sunglasses. And I don't remember actually ever really seeing his eyes on any of the news programs that I saw. Now, did I misunderstand that? Or did he somehow use his eyes? Can you clarify that for me?
He would wear the sunglasses, yes, but his eyes was part of his tactic of luring people to him. That was his method of luring. If you see my eyes, then you know that I'm true. Then you know that I'm honest. I'm trying to make this connection with you. That's what I want to do. And so that's how he was able to master using his eyes for that purpose. The other part of the model is that there's destructive idolization, where there comes a point where there's a turning point with the followers in their loyalty to Jim Jones. So what happened is that they see this repeat behavior. They'll make excuses for it and continue on, but then something will happen and they will change their mind and determine at that moment, I'm not going to do this anymore. I've had enough of this. There were different points in their lives when that decision was made. Most of it was made on that day, but there were certain things that happened. And so with destructive idolization, meaning that you can idolize someone no matter how destructive they are, no matter what it is that they do, you continue to believe in them. But that one thing will have you to do one of two things. You will either leave or you will stay. That's that turning point. And so that's the end of the model, the toxic followership model. It's a point where they get to the decision making.
Wendy, thank you so much for letting me bring out this question about the image that you created as part of your dissertation and your research to explain your toxic followership model. As researchers, we're always creating models. And I think it's probably important to explain a little bit about why we do that. That many times we're dealing with ideas and concepts that are so complex and abstract that there may not be enough words in the world for us to adequately explain them. But sometimes we get really lucky and we're able to take those and put them into a visual model, like the very elegant one you created, to help explain the phenomenon that we're seeing. And so even though it seems a little bit reductionistic and simplistic to take all of that and bring it into a model, it can be very important for helping people understand more about the phenomenon. And so, I'm so glad that you allowed me to kind of go down this little bit of a path with the model in this conversation, because it's important. Am I making too much of this, though?
I think that's absolutely right. So oftentimes as researchers, we develop models and we test models and they sit in a corner. I wanted to make sure, having done this, the one thing they asked me was, I want you to share this with the world so that people don't have to go through what we have been through. And so I wanted to design a model that was relatable. And it also, I just kind of played off of the information that was given me to develop the model. And that's what you can relate to. You can relate to the parts of the eye and how he used or misused his eyes in manipulating people. And then that's a way where people can make the connection and understand toxic followership. So you're right on.
So there's this tipping point or turning point for people that are in a toxic followership relationship. And that point is when they have to decide, what do they do about it? Do they stay within that relationship, or maybe even going deeper into that relationship, or do they get themselves out of that relationship? Well, I'm at the point where I really have to ask this particular question, Wendy. And that is, why is it important for us to pay attention to this whole issue of toxic followership? And I guess to put it another way, why should we care?
We do have to care because we encounter toxic followership all the time. And so why this is in a religious context, we see it in politics, we see it on the job, we see it in the community. We see it all the time. But when we see it, we kind of make excuses for it because we don't recognize it as toxic followership, right? That they're just having a bad day. Oh, that's just who they are, as though you should accept that. The reason why it's important to us is that you have to recognize toxic followership and not accept it. It's repeat behavior that does damage. And so you cannot ignore it. And there are strategies that we can learn to help a bad leader, course correct. But we don't want to continue to ignore it as if it's going to go away.
Wendy, I can imagine there's going to be people that will see this video, some of whom may say, Wendy, this is all well and good. And I can understand how some people could get hooked by a leader like Jim Jones or another very charismatic leader and follow them even to their death. But that's not me. I don't care how charismatic the person is. I don't care how important they think they are. I don't care how important their work is. I am just not that kind of person. So what I'm wondering is, what would you say to a person who says, I'm immune to becoming a toxic follower? That's just not me, and that's just not who I'm ever going to be.
Tell them that they were just like me. When I started off with this research, the one thing that I said is that could never be me. No way, my personality is different. I surely don't consider myself a sheep. Too articulate, no way, outgoing, extrovert. And then at the end of the research, I called my husband before I got on the plane because I just was a total different person coming home, and I needed him to understand I had learned so much that it changed me, because the surprise factor for me as a researcher was that I realized that it really could have been me. And so that goes to show the level of deception with immoral behavior, unethical behavior gone awry. Right. So this repeat behavior that is allowed to continue. And what I say to those when it shows up, like in business, you may not see people who are willing to give their life for the boss, but when it comes to money, they're willing to follow a bad leader for different reasons. And we have all witnessed that in one way or another. And so we have a responsibility as a follower. And that's also where I want to move people from, one, thinking that being a follower is such a bad thing. Well, it's a word that most people may not like, but we're called subordinates. That's acceptable. But when you say follower, it's a different ball game. They will use the word junior faculty, but you know your place. You're absolutely in a follower position, but there is power and there's a responsibility as a follower that you have to the leader, to support the leader in making better decisions. And so that's really taking the courageous follower work to do so.
Well, Wendy, I would be a bit remiss if I didn't ask this question, given everything we have been through just the last year or so. So 2020 was a very difficult year. 2021 has started off being pretty challenging as well, and a little bit wacky. So all of this makes me wonder, how is it that you are seeing toxic leadership manifest itself today?
And so let's focus just on one little nugget here, social media. So we're looking now at the power of social media, where people do want to be followers, and to have as many followers as you can, that's a great thing. But know who you're following. Know why you're following. I mean, we have groups that are out there that are creating sites with hate-filled organizations that continue to grow and they're based on lies. They're based on hateful memes. And this is something that is getting more and more prevalent, which led to the insurrectionists storming the nation's capital on January 6th. And then we see where, they're following the untruth. They're following falsehoods. They're following because they have this identity, this social identity with a group on social media, just untouchable, but enough to believe, to follow unto death. So that's the danger. That is the danger of how I'm seeing this played out now in the 21st century.
Yeah, Wendy, as I hear you talk about that, I'm reminded that just last night, my spouse and I watched an interview done by a CBS reporter with a man in jail. The man was known as the QAnon shaman on January 6th, and he was part of the group that stormed the Capitol of the United States. And he was very distinctive. He really stood out because he was wearing the horns, and his body was all painted up, and he stood in the middle of the Senate, and he had a bullhorn, and he was yelling and so on. And it was a really fascinating interview, because here was a guy that he felt that he was acting on a mandate, that he was so completely within his rights to go and be a part of that insurrection, and at the same time, now he's sitting there in jail. He's been in jail ever since that time, and he's quite possibly looking at 20 years in prison because he followed a lie, and he followed a myth that was being propagated out there. And the thing that really struck me was that not only did he do that, but then he was very surprised. He expressed surprise in the interview that he was not exonerated and released by the powers that be. That was his expectation. That was his expectation because he believed so strongly that he was in the right, and that his position and his allies were going to win the day.
At the end of the interviews, when I'm wrapping up with the participants, one of the participants made a comment that really was extremely surprising to me. And they said, if Jim Jones was alive today, I would still be with him.
Well, Wendy, we're not going to go any further down that rabbit hole, but I just want to say that there are really some striking parallels to what you have learned in your research and what we're observing taking place today. But I do want to move on to something else, and that is what you were involved in terms of your research today. Another thing that I remember from meeting you at ILA in 2019 in Ottawa, Canada, is that you and a colleague from Bowie State had a poster exhibit that you were talking about your latest research. And if I'm not mistaken, I believe your research is really about religious organizations and spirituality as it relates to toxic followership. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit more about your current research? I'm hoping I got that right. I'm hoping my memory was correct on that. And what is it you're trying to understand more clearly through your current research?
You're right. And my colleague, Davida Illy, and I are conducting research on the survivors of domestic violence and the impact of spirituality in their decisions, their decision-making process. So we used the framework of toxic followership and servant leadership. So let me be very clear right now, so that people don't get angry. We in no way are referring to the victims of domestic violence as toxic followers. Toxic followership is a role in the context that they have been exposed to from getting advice from the servant leaders of the spiritual leaders that they trusted. This is important because in our county, Prince George's County, we have a lot of churches that play a very big role in the lives of our citizens and in our community members here. And we want to be able to support the churches in helping victims of domestic violence. And so there's a learning that has to take place from the churches. So what we're hearing, we only have preliminary information, but if in fact there is support from, and it's not just churches, because I want to make, well, churches is the focus, but spirituality is what we found out in the particular research. Their advice came from spiritual leaders, was not healthy. And to some extent, it put them in bondage to remain in the situation that they were. And so that's where that toxicity came into play, from following the bad advice, not them as a person following bad people. It was the advice. And the advice was respected because of the positional power that this person, the spiritual leader, had spoken to them about. And so that's what we want to get to the truth. How can we help the churches to do a good job or a better job in supporting our citizens who are suffering with this domestic violence? And that includes anyone who is a victim of domestic violence. Our participants range from men and women of different ages. And so that's what's really important for us to do this research, so that we want to help the churches. Remember, especially the churches in Prince George's County, the Black church means something totally different. It's not just church. The Black church is historically the first ownership of land that we've had in this country. So church is where we are used to going. There is no separation of politics and religion. That's where we went for our fellowship. That's where we went for our information. This is where we spent our Wednesday night Bible studies, Sunday services, Sunday evening services. And so this is where we go for our information. We're used to going to church for that. And there is a loyalty to the leaders, right? Raised that way for what it meant, for what the Black church means to us as a people. And we want to be able to say, this is what's happening in our county, and this is the role that we see that you can play. Some of you are doing it well, and some may not be doing it at all for different reasons. So we're not there to blame, but we do want to be able to help. And so that's what the science behind our offer to support the church is, and as far as our research is concerned.
That's a really important point, Wendy, and I just want to put a pin on it because it is so very important. You draw this distinction, and you, by saying that the victims of domestic violence are not toxic followers. But where toxic followership comes into play is the conditioning that is used by some people that are in leadership roles in faith communities. I mean, after all, they're people with great positional power, and followers within their congregations or within their fellowships. They're trying to do everything they can to live out the tenets of the faith and the practices of the faith in a way that is consistent with the teachings of the faith. And in so doing, though, what can happen is that there can be some conditioning that that takes place that puts them in a position where they can be more easily abused. And I hope that I'm understanding that clearly.
That's a fair analysis of what we're doing, what's coming out of our research, and it is important when you what we're finding is that the servant leadership is coming from different places. It could come from family members, necessarily coming out of the church where it is expected. It's coming from different community members, people who also have had the same issues, who are becoming the support systems for the participants who were in our study. So that's what we're finding. It's really very, very, very interesting as we move forward and complete this research.
Wendy, if you don't mind, I would like to stay with this for just a couple of minutes. We are both researchers and students of organizational leadership. And certainly one of the things that we have both studied deeply is the whole concept of servant leadership. And so what we know is that when a person is a genuine servant leader, it can be a very powerful way to engage with people and to lead them for the greater good of their community or their faith community or their organization. And it's a very powerful model. But in the wrong hands, perhaps we call it pseudo servant leadership. It can be a very destructive model, because then it could present a way of engaging with our followers that actually makes them more susceptible to being hurt or being wounded or even being abused by the organization or system that we are in. One last thing here, Wendy. I just want to clarify something in terms of your current research. Are you only studying the Black church, or are you studying a broader group of faith communities and spiritual groups?
So we are the initial participants in the first phase of the study were in the county, and because of the demographics, we predominantly have those who were members of the Black church. That is not our intent, which is why I said this is just preliminary, because we are still conducting the research to expand that, so that we do capture other voices and have a diverse population represented.
Wendy, we need to begin to wrap this up, but we cannot end until we talk about this very exciting thing that's happening actually this month. And that is the release of your new book, Intoxicating Followership, that actually is based upon this research that we've been talking about in this conversation today. So here you go. Please tell us about Intoxicating Followership and when it's going to be ready and where we can get it.
So I'm very excited. This is the dissertation that's palatable. So it's really still educational, because it's an educational publisher, and it's an opportunity for people to understand toxic followership, the power dynamics, what it means with sacrificial leadership and charismatic leadership, to understand some of the behaviors when you encounter a bad leader, how they switch from one personality to the next, and that when we're talking about charisma, that there's the dark side of charisma as well. So I go into that, and then I make the analogies from the voices of the participants in my study and include them in there as well. I use the classic case, a foundational case of Enron from the business perspective. So part of the challenge is that when we talk about followership in general, most of the followership has always been spoken of from a business perspective or military. And then there was Wendy, who came with the research from the Jonestown Massacre and got the voices of the survivors, and that put it in a whole different realm. But we have to be able to make the parallel of toxic followership in any industry, in any place that you are, that you must do three things. You must recognize it, refute it, and because of the state it leaves you in, there is a restoration process, so you must be restored. And so those are the three things that I want to share about the book that you'll be left with.
Okay, you've really piqued my interest. Now, I get the first two, but restoration, can you say a little bit more about that and what that means?
Restoring yourself. How do I do that? What does that look like? You are broken when you realize that you've been duped. You feel jaded. You're left feeling empty. The level of grief and trauma that comes with encountering and dealing with a toxic leader, you need self-care. So we don't talk enough about self-care and what that means and what that looks like. And so there's a process that you have to find out for yourself what that looks like. It may mean getting counseling. It may mean separating yourself from others. It's a myriad of things. But restoration must take place because you don't want to carry that into your next relationships. You don't want to carry that into your next job. You don't want to carry that over and over again. And then you find out at the end that you have carried this baggage for so long that it has hindered you from having good health and good relationships, whether they're personal or work related. So that's the restoration piece.
Wendy, this has been so much fun, and I appreciate so much you're taking the time to have this conversation with me today. There's two things that I'm going to do coming out of this interview. One is I'm going to pre-order your book, and secondly, I'm going to be keeping my eyes on this new research that you're doing and following that along because it sounds absolutely fascinating. But you know what, Wendy? It's time for you to plug your book. Tell us again, give us the title and tell us how we can get it.
And the title is Intoxicating Followership, and you can get it on Amazon.com or EmeraldGroupPublishing.com.
And of course, Wendy, don't forget to remind people that they can pre-order your book on your website, right?
So drwendymedmonds.com is the book trailer for you to take a peek at that. And then you can also pre-order. The book will be released on March 16th, and the book launch is March 19th. All the information is on the website, drwendymedmonds.com.
Wendy, thank you so very much again for doing this interview with me today and having this conversation. And thank you for letting me pursue you for several months in trying to get you to do this interview as well. But this has been at least as rich as I imagined that it would be. You're doing some very important work. You're doing some very good work. And I hope there's a number of folks that, as a result of this interview, will go forward and pick up your material, pick up your book, and learn a little bit more, a lot more, in fact, about toxic followership, because it's so very important in this time. Again, thank you very much.
I want to thank you. I am humbled. I really am, and grateful for this opportunity. Thank you so much.